Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Brad Lips. I'm the CEO of Atlas Network, and I hope you've been enjoying our 2 days now of Asia Liberty Forum 2021. I'm very happy to be convening this session on liberalism and the free society. We are living through very difficult times, and this was driven home this week by the news of the closure of Apple Daily for a long time, a primary voice of freedom in Hong Kong, created by our friend Jimmy Lai, who now languishes in prison alongside others who've been associated with Apple Daily through the years. So I'll ask everyone on the call just to keep the heroes of Hong Kong and from other beleaguered parts of the world. Hope you keep them in your thoughts and prayers today. And I hope that we can take some inspiration from their commitment to principle and their bravery as we get started with what I hope is a great conversation with three really important leaders in the liberty movement in Asia. We're going to welcome Arpita Nepal, a pioneer of Nepal's liberty movement. She and her husband, Robin, started Samriti and very memorably hosted the second Asia Liberty Forum. I've also been very excited about how they've encouraged the growth of other organizations in the country, including Bikalpa, which of course, to whom we're very grateful as our partner for the Asia Liberty Forum this year. So welcome, Arpita.
Thank you, Brad. It's good to be back in ALF.
Fantastic. We also have with us Parth Shah, the founder of Center for Civil Society in New Delhi, whose organization won this year's Asia Liberty Award yesterday in the program, and who was actually the initial co-host of our Asia Liberty Forum starting a decade ago. So thanks for being with us, Parth. Trust we've got Parth there, but maybe on mute.
Thank you, Brad. Great to be here.
Perfect.
Thank you for the award.
Yes, very exciting and very well deserved. And then finally, we've got our honorary Asian, Rainer Heufers, who spent most of his career in Southeast Asia. He founded the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, which won the grand prize last year of the Templeton Freedom Award at our Liberty Forum. So welcome, Rainer.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for having me, and good to see everyone else here also on the program.
Indeed. Now, I am looking forward to learning a lot from all three of our participants, but also from you in the audience. We're going to reserve some time for discussion in the second half of this program. I hope you'll make use of the chat box to share observations and to pose questions as we go through this session. But I'm going to take the liberty of using the first few minutes that we have together to sort of set the stage. And I'll be talking about my new book, which I wrote in order to spur conversations like the one we're going to be having. The book is called Liberalism and the Free Society in 2021. You can order hard copies right now through our website and via Amazon. But just for our partners, we're going to distribute a link through the chat right now. We can send you a free electronic version of the book. So if you follow that link that my colleague Alyssa Dipidova is posting, you can request the book as a PDF. We'd be happy to share it with you. I wrote this book during a crazy year of lockdowns, realizing that while it was obvious that we were in the midst of a global health crisis, it was really important for people to realize that we're also in a freedom crisis. And my big hypothesis is that 2020 could go down as a really pivotal year in world history, perhaps for very negative reasons, but that is not preordained. A lot of history is going to be unfolding in the months and years to come. And we in the freedom movement should really take to heart that we're in a high leverage position where we might have some influence over whether the history of this decade is remembered as one that favored freedom or one that saw its decline. I contend that the groups that make up the freedom movement are really undervalued assets for revitalizing liberal democracy and thereby ensuring a brighter future. And I thought that the 40th anniversary of Atlas Network, which we're celebrating in the coming month, I thought that provided a really good opportunity for taking stock of our movement. So that's really section 1 of this book. I share that the combined annual budget of all of Atlas Network's partners is now a shade over $1 billion, so a rather big number. I also share that the typical group in our movement is actually rather modestly funded and rather scrappy. You know, the average group in our network is about 10 years old, has a staff of 7 full-time employees. And if it seems unlikely that the world can be changed by such lean organizations, I've got a chapter that talks about some of the amazing improvements in human freedom that have happened over the past 40 years and showing how our partners have played key roles in bringing those to fruition. The second section of the book takes stock of the state of the free society, the challenges and the opportunities in 2021. And I try to do this in 2 different ways. One is by looking at the various indices that we use to assess the state of human freedom. Many of you are familiar with the Economic Freedom of the World report that Fraser Institute spearheads. I also discuss a new index that I'm really proud to have been a part of this research that was originally inaugurated by an Argentine scholar named Carlos Newland, along with a Hungarian scholar, Paul Cegleti. And in this project, which we call the Global Index of Economic Mentality, we mine survey data that is released through the World Values Survey, which has been done for many years. There's some questions that really get to people's perspective about the proper role of government in economic matters, the fairness of market outcomes, the extent to which people really are responsible for their own well-being, the living standards that they achieve. And through some of these questions, we're able to essentially make an assessment about how free market the mentality of a country is. And it's still a kind of a blunt tool, but I think it could be a useful one since the whole raison d'etre of the think tank movement that we're a part of is to shape that in a positive way, to make it thereby more likely that we'll have policy advances that actually increase economic freedom, and believing that the public mood around these issues is an important one, and it's one that we can have an impact on. So in that section 2 of the book, we look at some of the initial findings of this global index of economic mentality. We also have conversations that I hosted and that have been transcribed in the book that include the thought leaders from different regions of the world. And there's one, I think, really interesting chapter called "Is This the Asian Century?" Which included Parth in the conversation, along with other friends of our cause from Hong Kong, from South Korea, and from Indonesia. And then in section 3 of this book, I present some of my own ideas about the path forward for us all. I make a case that is really primarily based on how I see political coalitions shifting in the United States, which I know best, but I hope there's some lessons that resonate in parts of Asia as well, with the thoughts I put together there. Well, I make the case that the hyperpolarization that we're seeing in the US and in other parts of the world is really an opportunity for the freedom movement to fill. Here in the US, we see the hard left and the radical cultural right really feeding off one another with competing forms of identity politics, both trying to enlarge the power of the state so that they can generate favors for the in-group and punish the out-group. We in our movement need to resist the temptation of getting sucked into that. We have to remain focused on principles, our belief in keeping the state focused on the very limited range of tasks that we need it to perform well, our goal of ensuring legal equality for all people, the importance of clearing away barriers to opportunity so that all people can thrive. So this, the last chapter of the book is really about giving a little bit of a pep talk about why we should be thinking bold about how much we can achieve if we really focus on a message of inclusivity, showing our empathy and our authentic belief in the dignity of each person, and also equal justice, drawing a sharp distinction against the illiberal idea of trying to use government to generate favors for some, punishments for others. So that's a short preview of the book, and hopefully something that gets this conversation pointed in the right direction. I'm now going to ask each of our participants to maybe take 5 minutes of their own to share some big picture thoughts about liberty in Asia, perhaps cueing off the book, but don't feel limited to that. Really want to spend the time we have in this session to talk about how the freedom movement can best direct its efforts to bring about positive change. So let's go ladies first with this and ask Arpita to share about 5 minutes of thoughts. Arpita?
Thank you, Brad. Excuse my internet. If things break up a little, please let me know. I'll shut down my video and hopefully my audio will be more audible to you. So in general, I think having had a preview to Brad's book, I think it's a fantastic book, and I really hope that you actually take a look at it, some really interesting ideas, and I think some ideas that resonate for around the world, no matter where we come from. With regards to Asia and things that sort of Brad's book and especially post-pandemic things that I've been thinking about in the freedom movement with regards to Asia in general, I think I have three big sort of pictures that I'd like to present to you today. Three big pictures that I think all of us involved in the freedom movement really need to take stock of and think about how we are going to address these situations. Especially in Asia and in South Asia particularly, because my experience, my cultural understanding is better for South Asia than East Asia or Southeast Asia in general. So I'll focus my observations more on South Asian context. So in that sense, I think we are very community-centric culture. And the index in general also, shows this. There's a reflection of following this paternalistic attitude, believing in government, a higher authority who's going to resolve all your problems. So I don't think South Asia has really come out of this cultural attitude in general. However, in the pandemic, what we saw was this first response where the community response, at least I can say for Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. I'm not so sure about India, and we have Parth here, so I'll let him comment on that. The community response, in fact, was the most effective response in terms of contact tracing, in terms of identifying isolation centers, providing food access, health access to these isolation people stuck in isolation centers. It was more a community and local government response. It wasn't a nationally coordinated response. In fact, the national government was in shambles at that point of time. So there was no coordinated response in that sense. But what that showed us was there is strength that we can capitalize, but it also brings to the forefront one principle in liberal democratic framework that I think some of us, if you especially are more inclined to, some inclinations within our own movement, that you tend to forget is this principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity where, I can resolve my problems best, and if I cannot, then my neighbors can help me, resolve my problems, and then you go on and move on, so on and so forth. And I think the pandemic response in general really strengthened this idea that we in the freedom movement need to take stock and take ownership of that idea and say that there's so many problems that can be solved at the local level. How can we strengthen local levels? Because there's always this, I also see this other, move towards centralization and authoritarianism across the Asian board. I think as a response to pandemic, everybody's looking at the government for answers, believing that a strong government is the answer to solutions. And this is getting a more, the populism right now really supports this idea. So I think in response to that, the freedom movement in general needs to take stock of saying, actually, here's where the solutions are coming from, and how can we capitalize on this idea and promote this idea further. So that's one aspect of it. The second is the proliferation of the virtual economy, new innovation coming out as a response to the pandemic, local solutions all coming in the virtual economy. Now, this presents a challenge in the freedom movement in general, which also Brad has highlighted to a certain extent in his book is every time some kind of innovation comes into the market, there's a natural response from the bureaucrats, or this technocratic response where you want to over-regulate it. People who do not understand what's happening with the innovation would like to bring out regulation so that it all comes under government purview. So in general, I think another sort of challenge that we really need to be aware in the freedom movement moving forward, as typically in Asia, where the virtual economy is not as widespread, is not as deep as, say, for example, in Western markets. It's not a deep market as yet. So there are so many experiments that are happening in the virtual economy, which means our regulators in essential, they do not understand what's happening. And so the natural response is, if I don't understand what's happening, it must be bad. Let's block this down. That's generally the policy response for things we are afraid of, things we don't know how to regulate, things we don't know how to bring into the tax bracket from the regulator's perspective. And so that's sort of a natural response I've seen time and again. And I think at least in Nepal, once again, I think I would claim this more because I've been more in contact with my colleagues in Bangladesh and Pakistan, more in at least these three countries, I've seen like these virtual solutions coming up. And these virtual solutions in general, I think the depth of the market is not there in these three countries. And in general, like the regulatory response, we need to be aware what the regulatory response is. How can we promote a regulatory framework that's still going to let these innovators, innovate and come up with solutions? So I think that's another sort of the aspect that we need to really think about. The last thing that I really want to quickly put forward is the nature of education. I think the pandemic really made us rethink the nature of education, how we deliver education, what kind of education do we deliver. And so I think there is really a good space for freedom movement to really work with young people. And how do we promote ideas that challenge this paternalistic cultural attitude that we come up with? And I think this sort of online education that has really come to the forefront now post-pandemic provides us with that opportunity that I think we can capitalize on. So those are sort of three big things that I would like to emphasize, and I'll stop there for now.
Oh, fantastic. Let's turn next to Parth. Oh, Parth, you're muted. Oh, there you
go. Thank you, Brad. Actually, I really loved the book. First of all, for the point that how effective we have been, how effective our partners have been in sort of changing the tide in their own countries, right? And you mentioned that combined budget is about $1 billion for our partners. The average size is about 7 employees that our partners have. I think one thing I take away from the book, and I think something for us to remember also, is that we should be very proud of what we have been able to achieve. Often you hear in our gatherings that our ideas appeal to the mind, but not to the heart. The left always has an advantage over us because their ideas obviously appeal to the heart, and people, as much of the research now shows, are motivated far more for their feelings and from what appeals to their heart than what appeals to the mind, right? And I think often we have been sort of beating ourselves up for not being able to do that we think we should be able to do. I think it's important for us to remember that just $1 billion, which is actually nothing, right, compared to what our opponents have. And it's of course, the whole government system is, in a sense, is stacked against us. If you put all the budgets of the governments of the world, it's a huge sums of money. And even the non-profit money that you count for largely goes to causes which do not support our approach to life and a good society, right? And so despite all of that opposition, right, and also the whole cultural industry, right, Bollywood, Hollywood, right, much of that is also in favor of those ideas, because of course, those are the ideas that appeal to the people's emotions and heart. Right? I think given all of that, I think one thing we should be very proud of and happy about, and I think we should repeat that often enough. And I think I find that in your book, examples that you gave are how much we are able to do despite the fact that we are so small, both in terms of resources, either monetary or human, right? I think that's one big takeaway from the book, that despite all of this handicap, we have been able to keep the envelope, push the envelope, and have we have been able to make a difference in our own countries. Right? So I think that's my one bigger message that I learned, and thing that keeps reminding me about why we should keep fighting this battle, because even with a small army, we are making a big change. Right? I think in terms of the third part and the point that you raised, what are possible new coalitions that we could foresee given the experience of the COVID pandemic, right? And how things have changed during that time. Maybe that allows us to think about new partners, new sort of platform that we can open up where we could have much bigger impact, right? So three things come to mind in terms of what has happened during the pandemic. One is the authoritarian sort of tendencies of the government have gone overboard, right? And everywhere governments have expanded their powers beyond what anyone thought was going to be possible in the 21st century, right? So I think that's an interesting development that has happened. What it means that, for example, in India, left has, in a sense, ruled the country for a much, much longer time. And now that the right-wing party, BJP, is in power, they're able to feel the abuse of the state instruments that can be done, right? So when they were in power, they never bothered about various laws restricting freedom of speech, various laws that allow government to put people behind bars without even accusing them of a formal crime, right? So all of those laws, some of which, of course, we carried forward from the British Raj, which the previous governments never bothered to change, right? Thinking that, of course, they would be able to use it wisely. They would never abuse those laws and those powers. Now, having seen what has happened during the pandemic with the different kind of government, they are all very much united, right? To be able to remove those laws from the books, because they see that they can't really function if the laws are going to be on the books. I think that's a great coalition to build. A lot of people who are opposed to this authoritarian expansion of the state, right? And many on the left, at least in India, and I'm sure in other countries also, could be good partners for this particular repeal of many of these draconian laws which have been there on the books. I think second thing we learned, and I think this is particularly true in India, frankly, we took personal liberties for granted, thinking that those are now well debated, well established, part of the Constitution, part of our many Supreme Court pronouncements and judgments on these issues. Turns out that that's not really the case, right? Governments can very easily take away those personal liberties, I mean, with a blink of an eye. And therefore, I think there are areas that we at least had not focused much on in India. For example, CCS has not focused. And I think that's, I see generally we have been focused more on economic freedom than on personal freedoms, right? I think that's the other area of work that I see where we would have a lot of partners from various other communities which are fighting for the individual rights, right? I think that's LGBT or many others, Dalit communities in India particularly so, right? So there are a good number of people who have been fighting for these personal freedoms. We can now associate and join hands with them to push that agenda even further. And the third and the last group I see, and which is something that you had, Brad, on the top of your list of the areas to focus on moving forward. And the first thing on the list was corporate welfare. Something that we do talk about, but we haven't been able to do much about it. But now I think it's becoming very clear to people that when push comes to shove, the ordinary people, the migrants, laborers, or street vendors and small entrepreneurs are not anywhere on the policy table. They have no influence despite the fact they have votes, right? Much of the benefit goes to organized sectors and organized lobbies. And I think that really, I hope, opens people's eyes that this is a huge problem. It's not just about corporates influencing government, but it's also about how governments function, right? And that was important for us to fight together on this whole idea of corporate welfare. So I think those are three areas: authoritarian powers, personal liberties which are under attack, and the corporate welfare, which to me seems like good ways of building larger coalitions.
Okay, thank you for those observations. Let's get some thoughts from Reiner And I'll encourage again our partners on the phone to also, or on the call, to be typing questions into the chat so we can call on them after we hear from our friend Rainer Heufers.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah, very interesting to hear the insights also from Arpita and Parth. And like Parth, I also take that last chapter where you look on the path forward as a particularly, at least for me, a particularly inspiring one, where I believe, this is really something we need to do, forward looking. So how do we move from here? What I like about your book is you try to say, okay, we have all these cultural divides, etc., but we need to move forward. So where do we go from here? And this is something that's been always very important to me. And if we need this new coalition, and I agree with you, Brad, and your book, that we need a new coalition of people who stand for inclusivity and for equal justice for all, that broadens our spectrum. And I do believe that is a good way forward also in Asia. Brings the question then still, of course, where is the liberal in this? Where is liberalism in this? And so I follow here the idea, I want to look at it from 4 different perspectives, and I follow Edmund Fawcett, who is a former journalist from The Economist, who wrote a book about liberalism, and I quite like his way of looking what are the shared characteristics of liberals. And I think I want to look at those 4 elements and then look at what I believe Asia is doing in these 4 areas, and also share something about what Chips is doing in Indonesia in these areas. So first characteristic of a liberal that he finds probably most important, because he brings it up first, is that liberals acknowledge an inevitable conflict in society. So, I mean, lots of other ideologies or philosophies would try to seek harmony, etc. But for liberals, it's quite clear society does have conflicts. We cannot avoid them. We need to manage them. And we're willing to go into these situations of conflicts. I think that's a very important part that we need to acknowledge, and that we need to have also with our coalition partners. We need to be able to agree to disagree. And so that, of course, clashes very much with especially the stereotypical Asian value of consensus and harmony. And we see that all the time. So when we go in and we're suggesting to trust people, and then there may be conflict, and then we already have the opposition of many people in Asia. So when we in Chips, when we do a project on food trade liberalization, where the government is very much engaged in balancing the demand and the supplies and has its fingers everywhere in the whole equation of supply and demand, to give that up, there's a fear of conflict. A fear of conflict between farmers and importers, etc. So that's really the underlying conflict that we are dealing with, giving up on that balance that is precarious in the eyes of many people in Indonesia. So it's a cultural factor that we are dealing with in that area. The second characteristic of a liberal is the distrust of power. Now, in Asia, we do have a strong trust in power, I believe. So many people trust the government or patrons in general. There's a strong patron-client relationship that's still alive in many communities that we see in Asia. And now with COVID-19, obviously that falls onto fertile ground, where people would say, aha, obviously we need the strong leadership here, we need to trust the power. And here, at least for Chips, we just pitched in the Shark Tank. You could see that. So we want to, because in the whole COVID and the vaccination against COVID, the government seems to be the dominant actor. But we want to make the case that the private sector has a role to play, just to give some counterweight here, and to show that government alone cannot pull this off. It requires private sector help, at least. The third characteristic is faith in human progress. And we have seen great books coming out also of this movement about human progress and what has been achieved. And here, I think that goes very well with Asians as I have known them over the years. I think Asians are generally quite optimistic. Of course, there's resistance. Of course, we have lots of movements against progress. But generally speaking, I believe Asian cultures are pretty much open to human progress. And I'm speaking now maybe more from a Southeast Asian perspective, but we see the digital economy here as something that is thriving. Far more than I would see that in Europe or even in the United States. And why is that? Because people embrace technologies. They have absolutely no problem to do this. And we see lots of unbanked households finally having access to financial services. We see micro enterprises going with digital solutions, etc. So lots of stuff is happening. And CHIPS is working in that area because that's an important tool for inclusive growth here from a liberal perspective. And then finally, the fourth aspect would be liberals share a deep respect for people. No matter who they are and in what positions they are, we just respect people. And I think also here Asia is quite, has made a lot of progress. I mean, think about the perception, at least, of Asia 20 years ago. A lot of people would think of sweatshops. A lot of people would think of a life isn't worth much in some of these cultures. At least these were Western perceptions. They may have been exaggerated. But by now this has changed. Asia is a solid trading partner in so many ways, and there's so much more trust in Asia. And I think also Asia itself has really changed in that regard, and we see a lot more respect for people that is growing in Asian cultures than in the past. For CHIPS, what we're doing, again, the respect for people is important. Equal justice for all, Brad, in your book. So we've done a child care policy study. It's maybe not a topic that's quite common among liberal think tanks, but we believe, you know, female labor force participation is at 56% in Indonesia versus 84% of male labor force participation. There's something that's not in balance. Women have a problem accessing jobs. Therefore, we need to see how can we make it that companies try to actually help mothers to come back once they have given birth and actually be able to work. Now that brings in other coalition partners than in the past. This helps us open up, and this is a core liberal demand that women have the same opportunities as men have. Now, the difference obviously is in the solutions. We are not suggesting subsidies. We're not suggesting that the government should take care of all of this. We've created a corporate guidebook where we give a checklist of what companies can do in order to support women in their workforce to actually provide childcare facilities. So these are just a couple of examples that I wanted to give. So in general, if I summarize, I'm quite optimistic. I think the world goes in a liberal direction. And we can, as a movement, try to facilitate that and try to overcome the resistance that we, of course, encounter from time to time. Thank you.
No, thank you for those great thoughts from all three speakers. I'll again invite our attendees to raise your hand to ask questions or to put it in the chat box. But maybe I'll try to get us started here with maybe one observation of mine is that I've been so impressed by the Asian think tank community, the Partners of Atlas Network in the region, who have been finding ways to pursue policy reforms that do, just on the margin, create more opportunities, especially for low-income populations in countries of Asia. And there's just such a on its face, that's a worthwhile endeavor, even if sometimes it doesn't seem like it's connected in this like sort of grand way to winning new adherents to the philosophy. So in some ways, I think there's maybe two things going on. There's sort of all the pragmatic work that we can do to actually liberate people, and over time this adds up. One question that I have really comes out of a similar conversation I had during our Europe Liberty Forum this week, where a friend from Lithuania was commenting that liberalism is sort of a grand idea, but Marxism is a grand narrative that appeals very emotionally to people's hearts. And our challenge is to try to make these little wins add up so people start to see that, in fact, there is a grand narrative to our ideas. And perhaps it's difficult because, as Reiner pointed out, we don't have the utopianism, that some other ideologies have. We acknowledge that conflict will exist, and the challenge is to manage it and not pretend that we can resolve it all from top down. But in some ways, I think these things are maybe competing, or maybe not. Maybe would ask if anyone among our three panelists would want to raise their hand to comment on whether or not that tension exists within the way you think about your think tank work, whether it's important to connect the policy objectives you're going for to a grander narrative to get people really excited about the liberal project writ large. Anybody want to take that on? Parth has raised a tentative hand there.
No, I think, but you really pointed out, I think, really a great question that we do need to think about. The way I think we have thought about and try to work on at CCS over the years is that we need to do both. Right? When we talk about ideas to young people, and as you know, CCS Academy engages with large number of young people across the country, we find that just talking about ideas is not enough to change hearts and minds. But along with those sort of larger ideas, if you can attach examples, for example, the work that we do with street vendors, right? I have seen how the minds change when we show a documentary on what is going on with street vendors and how government is dealing with them, what kind of licenses they are required to have to be able to operate a simple business like this, right? It really changes people's heart, right? And I think the challenge that we talked about, that I referred to earlier, between heart and the mind, right? I think doing work on the ground allows us to bring the heart into the picture, right? And therefore, when we talk about our ideas, it has a lot more salience, I think a lot more power to influence people. And they see not just the abstract idea of liberty, for example, why it is important, but also how that translates into action. What different things happen, or what things happen differently, right? Talking about doing development differently, right? On the ground because of these ideas. I think we need to do both of those things simultaneously. And yes, some people don't like this combination. I know that we had lots of debates around that, even at CCS, that are we spending a lot of time doing on the ground work and not enough trying to sort of talk about our larger philosophy to a larger audience.
See that Arpita has her hand raised. Arpita, can you take yourself off mute so we can hear you?
Sure, Brad, thanks. I'm going to shut down my video because my internet is really bad. So if I break, please let me know. I think it's a very interesting dilemma, and I take this more on a life cycle approach because I entered the movement when I was 18, and I was really enthusiastic when I was 18 of defending these ideals on saying black and white, on saying like, if you're not in this philosophy, then you're clearly against this philosophy. And there's a clear demarcation of like what's right and what's wrong in my worldview. As I grew older in the policy world, especially with the think tank, I realized that the world is absolutely gray and there are no black and white demarcation lines, and probably then finally understood this liberal perspective of tolerating different ideas and different individuals and how to accommodate that, how to accommodate this conflict in general within the policy framework. And within the policy framework, I think what Samriddhi especially has been very successful, I think I take that as one of our biggest achievements, is bringing these different ideas on the table and allowing everyone to voice their opinion and creating a space for rational debate for a policy solution that works for all of us. So not being dogmatic about saying, here's the right answer to this solution, but actually acknowledging that somebody else might bring in something that they feel very strongly about, acknowledging where they come from, why you think that what they're arguing for is actually quite a rational argument if you come from the background that they're talking about. So I think actually in the policy world, it is a lot about those compromises. And like Parth pointed out, within Samriddhi too, we've had this debate over and over and over again on, are we compromising on our ideals? Are we saying, like, are we giving up too much when we, take up this position? But I think we've always been clear that as a policy think tank, as certain ideals that we promote, here's where we stand, here's why we stand there. However, we are ready to discuss what might work for us as a compromise that works for all of us at this point of time. So when we sit on the table, we sit with that attitude on saying, okay, let's make this work. What are you willing to give? Here's why I think you should be giving up that, and sort of listen to the other side when saying like, this is how I think we should accommodate this. So I think this duality in general is an everyday struggle in a policy world of like saying, okay, how do you address this conflict? How much do you compromise at this given point of time while not losing the larger picture of what you're trying to promote?
Fantastic. Hey, Reiner, I'm thinking maybe you should take on one of the questions that has popped up in the chat, and thank you. We'll try to get to all of these. But Kathy Tai asks about this this COVID-related problem, where the response to COVID enabled a more authoritarian, top-down approach that has fed into this narrative that might be in some ways rooted in parts of Asian culture, this deference to authority. How do you counter to show that the real resilience has been coming from the bottom up? Are there examples in Indonesia that help you make that case?
I think, this has obviously been taken to the political arena, where in the geopolitical context, certain players are trying to make a case that the authoritarian model is winning and the democratic model is not, etc. And I do believe we have good evidence that this is actually not true. So over the time, at least, we've got that evidence. So at the beginning, it looked like that, but then because Europe and America had a pretty poor start, but now Europe and America are picking up quite quickly, and you see that now Asia is struggling more than before. So I would say we should draw the whole discussion into the enforcement area. So it's not about how decisions are made, as in the democracy versus authoritarian state, but rather whether the government is strong, not big, but strong, whether we have an enforcement capacity. And Indonesia is struggling, for example, with exactly that. So if you don't have a civil service that is able to actually implement certain restrictions or observe them and make sure they are basically be respected, then you end up with this problem. And I can't speak for South Asia, but for Southeast Asia, I do believe this is a big problem, where you see Singapore being very strict, but they have an enforcement system that works very well. And so I believe, yeah, we can show the examples that enforcement matters. Taiwan was also extremely fast and successful. And now we see cases rising in many countries again. And so I think we still have good examples why this works in countries with strong enforcement.
Yeah.
Can I come up with two quick examples of where I've seen like community work better, because that's what I was trying to get at. Is two examples in Nepal. One is in terms of the first wave when we started with contact tracing. It was the local community that came together and said, here, I've come into contact with this person, I might be susceptible to this. And all this putting together was done at the local level by local politicians who are not even elected officials, on reaching out to their constituency and saying, if you are stuck somewhere else and you would like to get home, we are going to provision, the vehicle for you. The community coming together, putting money together to transport people, to put them into isolation centers. All of that happened completely at the local level in Nepal before the central government even realized what was happening with the pandemic. And they were so Kathmandu-centric at that point of time. So that's one. The second is when the second dose of vaccine essentially is being administered, which is ongoing right now in Nepal. The second dose of vaccine has been devolved to the community level. So the acquisition might have been more central. However, the distribution aspect has been completely handled at the community level. And the community response is fantastic, because when it was my first dose was centrally administered, and I had to stand in line in the sun for 5 hours to get my first dose of vaccine, whereas my second dose was community administered. And in my second dose, I got in and out within 5 minutes without touching anybody and coming into, maintaining the social distance, sort of this norm. So in general, it's become very effective. So I think there are plenty of examples like this if we just look for these stories.
Thank you for that. Well, one question that Anthea posed, I think is something that comes up in the chapter that was devoted to Asia here, is the persistence of the China model, at least in people's imagination. I'm really partial to the history that Ninh Wang did with Rankos before he died, focusing on how you can look at the marginal revolution that took place in China as something that really sprung from the bottom up, with a relaxation of rules as opposed to something that was engineered from the top down. But I think there's now this perception that the China model is one that combines aspects of capitalism with central authority directing it. And that's obviously a challenge to the extent that people see it as producing superior economic returns, and it certainly has been working for some time. But I do wonder whether maybe during COVID and some of the problems we've seen in China with secrecy, the surveillance state, if that's maybe changing the way that the model is viewed and maybe providing an opportunity. Parth, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I think those who have been able to stay in touch more systematically about what's going on around the pandemic, right? I do feel, this is just my, of course, anecdotal evidence. I do feel that people have realized the downside of Chinese model quite clearly. I think two, three things you pointed out about surveillance state, about the secrecy around the Wuhan virus and its origins, right? And the influence China exercised on the World Health Organization, WHO, right? I think all of those things are becoming quite clear that this model that may be successful in economic regeneration, right? Because you can leave people alone in the economic arena and let them sort of produce wealth that the party and the government can enjoy. But it's not really a successful approach when it comes to larger aspect of good life or fulfilling life or flourishing life. Right? I think that part of argument that we have been unable to make earlier, I think it's been very clearly made. And I see huge change in the mindset of people, at least among those who have been keeping track of what's going on with the pandemic.
If I may add to that, Brett. I mean, I was a China researcher before I came to Indonesia, so I've been studying China since 1984, and so I've observed the entire transformation process there quite closely. And China has changed. We need to see that there's not just one model. China has gone through so many different models since the 1970s, since the opening up process, and obviously now the new leader wants to also make it look as if this is all being centrally planned and centrally steered, etc. But when you look at the reality, and that's what Ning Wang and Ronald Coase wrote about, right? It's actually not the case. And so hopefully when we get to a new model, a new stage in China's development, we will see more evidence-based analysis coming out of China as well.
Now, our friend from CPBR in India quoted a recent article that was looking at one of India's top think tanks, and I don't know if you saw the quote there in the chat box, but the proponents of liberalism must reassess how to package their ideals in a manner palatable and appealing to the voting public. I guess we've touched on this a little bit, but is there anything you'd want to say about explicitly how you think about the messaging when you're running public campaigns for your policy goals?
Yeah, I think the word that you have used in the book more often than I think any other word, I see throughout this Asia Liberty Forum, the word that we have been using is human dignity, right? And I think that's the word. I can't remember, it's a few years ago, that was part of our vocabulary in the conversation that we had internally, right? So I think in some sense, we have also realized that liberty as a value is of tremendous appeal to some people, and they see the logical connections along with the philosophical sort of dimensions of liberty, and how it applies to all aspects of our individual life, the community life, as well as the national life, right? But it's not very easy for many people to see those connections. And therefore, my sense has been that as we are using the word dignity in our conversations and emphasizing that part of it, we really need to bring back what has been, at least to my mind, is in the Indian Constitution. So there are 4 values in this sort of, in a sense, in the beginning of the Constitution they talk about, right? The topmost is justice, then liberty, equality, and fraternity. Right? And I think all of those values together build the kind of ideas that we want to build. And so we need to sort of expand, in a sense, our concerns beyond liberty to dignity, obviously, but along with that to justice, which is what we mean in some sense by dignity, right? And equality. I think often we are very squeamish about when somebody says, do we believe in equality? Our answer is yes, but, right? And we redefine what we mean, what kind of equality we believe in. And therefore you're always defensive in that case, right? And I have learned in my interaction with the people, particularly young students, that you agree with them. Yes, we are as much a champion of liberty and equality as anybody else, right? And justice for that matter. Now question is, how do we achieve those things? And I think when we ask that question, how, then I think we have much better answers than the other side. And I think we need to bring the debate to the how and not to the values, what. And I think somehow we can change that part of it. I think we can do much better in building the coalitions.
Yeah. I'll ask Arpita, would you like to share any thoughts on this topic?
Quickly, I just love the use of the word livelihood. That's part essentially CCS popularized in Asia. I think that's a very smart use of the word instead of, because capitalism directly, economic freedom, we can argue to our, until our heads agree about like why this is a rational thing to do. But connecting something that is so, like you said, like if you change the narrative to something that's heartwarming, it's not just rational thought of what your brain says is right. This is actually, feel good factor. I think the word livelihood has really served us in that. So I would really, I think we need to borrow that word across the board.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I also appreciate about what Parth added to this conversation is this idea of there being more to a flourishing life than economic growth. I think a lot of the time we in the liberty movement have been guilty of really justifying our ideas as though it's all about things you can graph and equations you can write, when really what we appreciate is that freedom means freedom to do lots of different things, and there's lots of dimensions to it. And at the end of the day, it's that those opportunities and the ability of humans to dictate their own terms of life that is what matters. And maybe at a time when the economic conversation is a little bit muddled, but people are a little bit more, they're increasingly aware of the dangers of how government can overplay their hand when you trust them with too much power in COVID. And as we see in China, it gives us an opportunity to show that ours is not a really materialistic philosophy, but one that is more spiritual and more in tune with real human values. Reinhard, you had mentioned in an early conversation before this, before we went live, about how it's interesting in the Global Index of Economic Mentality that I present in the book, that several Asian countries are scoring low because they favor redistribution and they're uncertain about the efficiency of the free market, but they do tend to have higher scores when it comes to expecting individuals to be responsible for themselves. I'm curious if you have thoughts about reasons for that finding, or any implications it has for the work you do at CHIPS.
Yeah, I was I found it very interesting when I saw the results of that general index, global index of economic mentality, right? Where South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia all score relatively little in the area of efficiency, private sector initiative, but relatively high in the area of individual responsibility. And it seems quite logical to me. It's quite plausible. How, I mean, as I said earlier, there is a strong trust in power. So there is still this patron-client relationship where people expect certain things to be delivered by those in power. But on the other hand, what they expect to be delivered is sometimes not the personal wealth. It's more like I expect reputation, like a nationalist impulse. I expect certain moral leadership. So I expect these things from the top, and a certain, of course, safety that I'm not being attacked, etc. But my wealth, many Asians, most Asians have not experienced that the government will give them anything that contributes to their wealth. The Chinese have definitely worked very hard for their wealth, and the Indonesians have to do the same. And I think the Indians and South Asians have the same experience. So I'm not surprised to see that. So we see that people work very hard for the individual wealth, and that's something that is so great for our movement, because that's where we pick up. That's what people want. That's the livelihoods that they are actually trying to achieve. And education helps them on the way. So I think there's so much that works for us and that we can actually nurture and grow with those values that we find in the societies.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. We're bumping up towards the end of this session, so perhaps I'll give Arpita and Parth maybe a chance to do 60 seconds if you wanted to comment on what Reiner has just said. Arpita, would you like to go first?
I agree 100% with Reiner. I think the reflection, the index is an interesting result is because although we expect the patronizing, so we can't let go of this patriotic culture that we come from, but at the same time, we actually do not expect governments to deliver because we've been disappointed all our lives. So we sort of expect this shoddy delivery in terms of public, utilities that you normally expect from the government. So in that sense, it makes perfect sense that my individual wealth is completely tied to me and got nothing to do with the government. So I really understand that result in that context. It might look perplexing for somebody from the outside. But having said that, I think absolutely we're spot on. We need to just capitalize on the fact that we do know, in general, the Asian culture, I think, really celebrates the individual to work hard. And if you work hard, then you're going to do well in general in your life. So I think that is a value that we can absolutely capitalize on.
Very good. Parth.
I had not really thought about this earlier, but just hearing your question and the answers, of course, I agree with the larger message that Reiner and Arpita are giving in terms of personal wealth and how Asians are attached to that. I think the word redistribution, now I have not seen the exact question which has been asked in the survey. To me, I think we are over-interpreting it in a way that means distribution or distribution by the government. Right? I think often some of these words have very different connotations in the colloquial and local mind. Right? And it could simply be a reflection of the fact that yes, society should be doing something to make sure that everybody gets help that they need. Right? I think similarly also in terms of looking up to the authority. Now it's not always the government authority that people are looking up to. I think it's India and I think many parts of the world, the civilizational sort of powers have not been with the state, right? It has been with, as Gurucharan pointed out yesterday, with the different community of people, right? And then different leaders that come out from those communities. So I think often we think that we are attaching everything to the state in a way we look at some of this data, and maybe it's important to dissect that and see whether are people simply referring to their own generosity when they say redistribution as opposed to state power.
No, thank you for that observation, Parth. And yeah, I think it's an important takeaway for those of you that wind up taking a look at the book and studying the results of the Global Index of Economic Mentality. I think this is really the beginning of a conversation and certainly not any definitive end to it. But I'm hopeful that that's a good tool for thinking about the big challenge that we in this movement have of changing minds and leading people to be curious about liberal policy reform, and sort of the same thing for the book. At the end, I'm pretty careful to say that I'm trying to present a plausible path forward when I talk about how I think that we could really do more to be messaging around inclusivity, equality of opportunity, railing against cronyism and identity politics. I don't know that that's the path forward, but I think it's a path forward that can be helpful to start some discussions, because I really feel that while we're not going to have a single answer, we all do better if we get very intentional about our own strategies to advancing liberty. So if you, again, if you want a free electronic copy of the book, please follow the link that I believe Chelsea, if she's still there, will repost in the chat box. There's a short form to fill out. It's a form that gives you space to let us know how you might plan to use the book. If you'd like me to speak on a podcast, if you plan to review it in your newsletter, we'd like to keep track of how you might be able to help expose broader audiences to this conversation. So thank you in advance for any ideas you have along those lines. In the meantime, let's thank Arpita, Parth, and Reiner for a really rewarding conversation today. The final session of Asia Liberty Forum 2021 is coming up right now. We have to hustle over to the final session, a conversation on women's business in Asia. Promises to be very interesting, so I will see you there, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.